Who is the lineal champion of every weight class in the UFC? Who is the guy who beat the guy, whether they stayed in the promotion in the UFC or even moved up in weight? For example, the newer weight classes, flyweight, bantamweight and featherweight. These divisions have very simple and short roads to the modern lineal champion, and for this reason I'm not doing the women's divisions. Let's take flyweight for example. Demetrius Johnson was the inaugural champion. He held on to the belt until Henry Cejudo edged him out over 5 rounds, but then Cejudo moved up to bantamweight, going unbeaten there until he returned this year to lose to Aljamain Sterling. So as weird as it sounds, that kinda makes Aljamain Sterling the lineal champion of the flyweight division. And trust me, they get way more interesting as we dive into the older weight classes, the ones that go into the 1990s. But for another example, let's do bantamweight. The first champion was of course Dominic Cruz, who had tremendous success in the WEC, carrying it over to the UFC, and after defending his belt a few times, he fell into one of the wildest injury spirals imaginable. And had those injuries caused him to actually retire, he would have left the sport as the lineal champion of the 135-pound weight class. But when he did return, it was Cody Garbrandt who managed to beat him. And you'll remember that Cody's brilliant performance was followed by a series of crushing defeats. And of course it was TJ Dillashaw who chinned him first to win back his old belt. But what happened then? Well, TJ immediately went down to flyweight and lost to Henry Cejudo, who as we know, eventually lost to Aljamain Sterling. So this is a rare example of a current champion who is also technically the lineal champion. This does not happen again in the video. As we get further in, you'll see what happens when a lineal champion leaves the UFC behind them, fights in another promotion in different weight classes, and often you'll end up with a pathway that could not be further removed from the first champion's division. So let's look at featherweight next, the last of the newer weight classes. Jose Aldo was of course the inaugural champion here. He ruled the 145-pounders for quite some time, until Conor McGregor came along and KO'd him in 13 seconds. But when Conor overextended himself at welterweight and lost to Nate Diaz, then the lineal title went to Stockton. However, Conor immediately won it back in their UFC 202 rematch, eventually furthering his reign by stopping Eddie Alvarez to become a 2-weight world champion. And no, we're not going to count Floyd Mayweather as the lineal featherweight king, as funny as that might be, but Khabib Nurmagomedov instead was the next person to beat Conor in the cage, and as we all know, he never lost another fight, retiring with a perfect unbeaten record after 3 title defenses, making him the lineal featherweight champ. Okay, but those first few divisions were pretty straightforward and pretty short. Here's where things start to get a bit interesting. The lightweight division was initially kicked off with a championship victory from Jens Pulver, who beat Cal Uno to win the belt. He then successfully defended it against Dennis Hallman and a young BJ Penn. But following this, Pulver left the UFC behind him after a contract dispute, exiting without losing as the lightweight champion, or as lineal champ. And he also won his first 2 matchups outside of the UFC before getting knocked out by Duane Ludwig in just over a minute. Ludwig, who would of course go on to coach TJ Dillashaw, earned a 2003 matchup with Genki Sudo in the UFC as a result of beating Pulver, and though he did win, he would also exit the promotion shortly after, fighting BJ Penn in Japan at welterweight. Ludwig lost this fight by submission, and with that, BJ Penn became the lineal champion. Now remember when I said things are going to get very interesting? Well, Penn managed to beat Rodrigo Gracie next at middleweight, and then, as a natural lightweight, accepted a wild open-weight fight with a 225-pound Lyoto Machida. BJ understandably lost this fight on the scorecards, and so the lineal lightweight title went to the natural light heavyweight Machida. Now this was Lyoto's 6th pro fight, and between 2005 and 2009, he would climb up through the sport, eventually finding his way to the UFC before beating Rashad Evans to become the 205-pound champion. Then, a controversial win over Shogun Rua was followed by a rematch between the two, and this time, after leaving it to the judges in their first fight, Shogun decisively finished Lyoto in the first round to win the belt, and with that, the lineal title. But his reign would not last long. In his next bout, Shogun Rua was rendered totally helpless in the face of a future legend, as the 23-year-old John Jones totally dominated him before eventually scoring a 3rd round TKO win. That made John Jones the lineal champion of the lightweight division, and obviously he never lost again. Next up at welterweight, we have another example of a fighter who won the belt, defended it, and then parted ways with the UFC. Pat Miletich was the first welterweight champion, and he defended that title against Jorge Patino at UFC 18 before leaving the promotion in favor of a move to Japan, only to lose to Jutaro Nakao. And yeah, the 170 title was actually passed around the regional scene in Japan for quite a while. style, with Nakao eventually losing to Tetsuji Kato, before he was then beaten by Hayato Sakurai. But then, in 2001, long before his eventual UFC debut, a much younger Anderson Silva managed to beat Sakurai on the scorecards to claim the title. Now, if you guys are thinking, oh yeah, this title is just gonna stay with Silva up until Weidman, you're wrong. 2 years later, Silva lost to Daiju Takase by way of submission, losing the welterweight lineal title in the process. After that, Daiju was beaten by Rodrigo Gracie on the scorecards, and from there we have a familiar timeline that fits in with the lightweight division. You'll remember that Rodrigo Gracie went on to lose to BJ Penn lost to Lyoto Machida lost to Shogun Rua, and Shogun would go on to lose to this now 2-divisional lineal champion, John Jones. But don't worry, crossovers like this are few and far between. On a quick side note, if you're enjoying this video, be sure to let us know in the comment section below before leaving a like and subscribing so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. The middleweight division comes in next, a championship that was first claimed by Dave Mene, although it was a short-lived reign given that Murilo Bustamante beat him in his next defense. Bustamante would defend that belt once before leaving the UFC to sign with Pride, but Quinton Rampage Jackson was there waiting for him, winning a split decision over Bustamante before going on to beat Chuck Liddell by corner stoppage. However, his time as champion would come to a very sudden halt when Vanderlei Silva proved to be a bad matchup for him, TKOing Rampage in about 6 minutes, and Vanderlei would manage to have a very good run of success, KOing his next 2 opponents, before finishing Rampage again in a fight of the year for 2004. But Silva would go on to lose a split decision to Mark Hunt, bringing the lineal middleweight title up to heavyweight, and Hunt himself, despite winning his next 3, was about to hit an infamous dip in form, losing 6 fights in a row, the first of which was to Josh Barnett. The newly crowned lineal champion Barnett would actually beat Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira in his next outing, but after that Mirko Cro Cop would move to 3-0 over him with a TKO. This Mirko had already fought and lost to Fedor Emelianenko and would not fight again under the Pride banner, instead moving to the UFC to test himself, and despite winning his debut, would eventually get head kicked by Gabriel Gonzaga in one of the greatest knockout moments of all time. Gonzaga off this win would get a title shot, but would not be able to stand up to the might of Randy Couture, and with that, the lineal championship would pass to Randy. Couture, for all of his greatness, was never one to put together massive win streaks, and in his next outing he was knocked out by a certain Mr. Brock Lesnar, who went on to have a surprising level of success as champion, defending his belt twice before getting mauled by Cain Velasquez. At this point it seemed like Cain was going to rule over the division for as long as he remained healthy, so when Junior Dos Santos found his chin in one of the opening exchanges in their first fight for the quick knockout win, it was a pretty big shock. But Cain of course would return with a confident performance in the rematch, and eventually in their trilogy fight as well, bludgeoning JDS in brutal fashion to reclaim his belt and the lineal title. That title would eventually pass to Fabrizio Verdum, however, when he subbed a fatigued Cain to earn the belt. But then, in one of the all-time great low fight IQ moments, and trust me, I love Verdum, but running after Stipe Miocic was a moment of true insanity, one that deserved to be punished with a TKO loss. Stipe would of course go on to become the greatest UFC heavyweight of all time, but he would lose his lineal and UFC titles to Daniel Cormier, before winning them both back again over the course of 3 fights. But in the end, Miocic's reign would come to a violent conclusion when an old foe, Francis Ngannou, clawed his way into a rematch with the champion, and this time he was very clearly ready. And of course Francis Ngannou is still unbeaten on this run, making him your lineal champion at middleweight. But don't make the mistake of thinking that things are going to be obvious when it comes to 205 pounds, because light heavyweight actually bucks the trend. Frank Shamrock was the first champion at 205 pounds. They did call it the middleweight division at the time, but it was 205. He defended that belt 4 times, beating Tito Ortiz in the 1999 Fight of the Year in defense number 4. And for as much as Dana White has tried to scrub Shamrock's name from the history books, he was an undeniable great and pioneer of this division. In fact, it would take 10 years for Frank to lose, although there were long stretches of inactivity. Renzo Gracie would become the first person to beat Frank Shamrock in a decade, although Frank did lose by DQ. Renzo then moved on as champion until he lost to an aging Matt Hughes, who then himself went on to lose to an aging BJ Penn. And this is not the BJ Penn who would set up the Machida Shogun link. No, this was the final win of BJ Penn's career, and his subsequent drubbing at the hands of Nick Diaz brought yet another lineal title to Stockton, albeit only briefly. Carlos Condit would beat Nick Diaz in a very close decision before losing to the champion, Georges St-Pierre, and of course GSP never lost again. So there you have it, Georges St-Pierre, a natural welterweight, is your lineal light heavyweight champion. That of course just leaves the heavyweights. The first UFC champion of the division was the great Mark Coleman, the godfather of ground and pound, who won his title by beating Dan Severn in the inaugural championship matchup for the weight class. He would go on to lose to Maurice Smith in his next fight, who in turn would beat Tank Abbott, before losing his belt in 1997 to a young Randy Couture. Well, I say young, but the dude started his pro MMA career at 34 years old, so he has been kind of eternally old, but a younger Randy he was nevertheless. Anyway, Couture left the UFC for a few years to fight in Japan, and immediately got submitted by the icon Enson Inoue in about 90 seconds of their fight. But Inoue only held the title for one fight before losing to the great wrestler Mark Kerr, and this lineal title in particular was being passed around with some major regularity during this time. Mark Kerr then lost it pretty much immediately to Kazuyuki Fujita, another hero of Japanese MMA. But then, 3 years after initially losing this title, Mark Coleman would return and beat Fujita to begin his second reign as the lineal king. And this one did last a little longer, just over a year, until Big Nog himself, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, defeated him by way of submission. And from there, Minotauro Nogueira would of course lose his title to Fedor Emelianenko, who would then go on one of the most legendary spells of form in the history of the sport, up until Fabrizio Verdum managed to submit him in the opening round. But this Verdum had not yet gone to the UFC, and a loss to Alistair Overeem in Strikeforce would take him out of the picture, at least for now. Overeem would then arrive in the UFC with major confidence, absolutely steamrolling Brock Lesnar before going in way too cocky against Antonio Bigfoot Silva, which led to him losing by a shocking upset KO. Bigfoot though would end up getting eviscerated by Cain Velasquez, and from there that leads us into the familiar run of Cain losing to Fabrizio Verdum, Fabrizio Verdum running into Stipe Miocic, Stipe losing to DC in the first round, and then of course DC losing to Stipe in their rematch, before the lineal middleweight champion Francis Ngannou swoops in and takes home the lineal heavyweight title as well. So there you have it, 2 belts for the flyweight and bantamweight lineal champion Aljamain Sterling, 1 belt for the lineal featherweight king Khabib Nurmagomedov, 2 belts for the lineal lightweight and welterweight champion John Jones, for the lineal light heavyweight divisional champ, 1 belt for Georges St-Pierre, and 2 for Francis Ngannou at middleweight and heavyweight, making him and Aljamain Sterling the only champions to actually hold their own natural weight class's lineal title. But that's the end of the video. So what did you think of this as a concept? And would you be interested in seeing more in a similar style? It was definitely a fun video to research, and when I had the idea I pretty much immediately took to mapping it all out to see who won. Anyway, do let us know in the comments section below before leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single upload. Thanks for watching.